am really excited to kick this off with some questions from the audience. There's a one question from Yanis. Let's back it up and talk about ants generally. How do you, so Yanis asks about how you determine whether or not like a specific group of ants is a species. Are you doing it through visualization, through genetic analyses? Like, how does that work?
That's a really great question. So it kind of depends. Initially, sort of a lot of species work has been done visually based on if ants look similar. I think that's hard specifically in ants because I sort of mentioned this a little bit, but soldier ants and worker ants and queen ants from the same species actually can look really, really different from each other. And male ants look like flies half the time, honestly. Like they don't even look like ants most of the time.
Yeah. When I saw a picture of a winged ant, I was like, wait, that's an ant? So it blew my mind, the diversity of morphology that they have, what they look like.
Yeah, so I think people are definitely starting to go into genetics to do this, which brings up the question, how different do you have to be genetically to be a species? And I think that's a question that's still sort of out there in the field. And a lot of times the definition is also based on, can two species interbreed? But again, that gets confusing for ants that only the queen reproduces and yes. Really, really picky. And so it's a great question.
They don't make it easy.
I don't have one answer, but I think it's some combination of visually and genetics and guessing and re-looking at things as we learn more to see if things that we thought were a species are really one species or two or
right. I think that gets at the concept that science is both simultaneously reliable and tentative. We know what we know with the tools that we have at the time. So so I guess more on that throughout life. All right, let's get to some questions about the paper. So Juan asks about the contagiousness of the material that was used to inject the ants to elicit an immune response.
That's a great question. So this is actually a criticism I have about the paper. I'm going to be fully honest that I don't know a ton about this sort of the background in this field. I do know this is some of the first work that's been done on this specific species of ant. And I was also, as I read the paper and as I've been talking about the paper, I'm really curious, like how sick were the ants really? And like how long were they sick for? And how would we even begin to test that or look at that? Because you can't ask an ant if they're sick or not. You could look at behaviors, which they sort of did. And they did see that by the end of the injection, by the end of the time that they looked, the ants seemed to be getting better. But does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I think, because part of the question is what does the survival curve looks like, but it sounds like you don't know the answer to that because that wasn't necessarily reported. And we don't know if it was even strong enough of an immune response to make them like super sick. It's not, did they have a sniffle or did they have COVID,
Right, exactly. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know if that is different individual to individual. And I don't know that you would necessarily, I imagine that the ants weren't super, super sick because it's hard to do experiments on things that are very sick.
Right.
But some of them died, like the isolated ones, some of them did die. So that's a different experiment, the fungus, but the fungus did seem to make them sicker.
Okay, so that was a follow-up question about the fungal experiments, where could the fungal experiments be contagious to, did they do any kind of like survival curves on the fungal experiments? Were the fungal experiments, like was the fungus contagious, if you know?
I'm remembering, so the way they did the experiments, they either, and I'm going to apologize because I don't remember exactly what they did, but when they did the experiments, they tried to specifically keep it in the window of time before the fungus could potentially infect other ants in the colony. So only the sick ant would be the one that was sick and they would not be contagious.
So what about This idea of grooming seems really interesting as a mechanism for either like giving immunity, like I kind of think about it like breastfeeding, for example. It's like you're passing on something. Do they ever do experiments? You know how they have like naked roll, like germ-free mice or germ-free rodents of any kind? Do they ever have like germ-free insect models or ants to sort of see, if they can detect factors that, I don't know, might have something to do with microbiome or might have to, do you know if any of that is being done?
I'm trying to think. I don't really know. I think it's a really cool topic. There's definitely some work on sort of symbiosis and microbes. And I mean, something sort of off the cuff that I thought of when you said all that, it's not exactly an immune response, but like our ants sometimes have nematodes in their heads. So when you dissect out their brains, you see nematodes, so
Really?
tiny worms. It's not
Wow.
fun. It's really freaky. Um,
Wow.
so
Is
like
that normal? Like, is that,
usually when they're
are
sick,
they?
it's usually when they're like, it's one of the signs we say they're sick or they're not doing as well.
Wow.
But I guess I got a bit off topic. I think I don't know the answer to that, but those are sort of things that I've thought of related to your question.
Right. Yeah. And I think here's a question that we've been sort of expecting. And we're in this parallel situation where here we are um, making these decisions on whether to isolate or to caretake. And this is such a really tough time, I think, for humans. And so Yanis asked, do you think that the one lesson we can learn from ants and apply it to the COVID pandemic is to not isolate the sick and hospitalized? How do you think we can relate this to COVID?
I think it's really hard. And this is a question Jeannie and I and others on the D4P team have been talking about for a while. I mean, first off, these are ants. These aren't people.
Right.
We don't know what the ants are doing when they're caretaking. What does caretaking mean? Like, obviously they're not intubating ants, but what does caretaking look like? We also don't know how sick these ants are. So there are also ant species that will isolate the sick or send the sick out. And so I think it's really hard to take sort of what we've learned from this paper and directly apply it to humans. Although I do think there are sort of themes that are interesting in thinking about caretaking. And like, I mean, caretaking also looks like being in the hospital. Caretaking looks like making sure you're wearing a mask to protect your colony or your people around you. So I think sort of it's hard to directly relate what ants are doing to how to solve our pandemic and our horrible situation we're in. But I do think we can look to ants as a guide for these ants are grooming the other ants for the benefit of the colony. Because the other thing that we think about a lot in ants that I didn't really have time to mention is that an individual ant dying doesn't make a huge difference to the colony unless that ant is a queen, because they're not reproducing, they're not passing along any genetic material. And so there must be a reason why these ants are still taking care of a sick ant when they have others that can reproduce who are very similar.
Right.
So
do you think that it has something to do with being like altruistic? Is there any evidence of altruism taking place in an ant colony?
there definitely is, but there's also selfishness, because usually the altruism happens when an ant is genetically similar enough that it's okay if they die because their genetic material is similar enough. So it's sort of this pull and tug of how closely related you are and how altruistic will you be.
How interesting. And on a scale, like we know ants are a highly social, like they have high social organization. Is that a true statement? Yeah. And how would you rate like humans on versus ants? I mean, are there this is the battle of the more social species. Which one is it?
Like, can I phone a friend? I see Taylor, one of the later D4P. No, I won't ask Taylor to jump in. I mean, I think so. Ants are eusocial organisms, which means that they meet this criteria of living in a colony, having overlapping reproduction, they have only some members reproduce, and we have and they have overlapping generations. I mean, from the perspective of eusociality, ants are far more eusocial than humans.
Right.
But
Right.
for human defined social behavior, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Like ants aren't like
Taylor, feel free to chime in the chat if you want.
going to school or, they're not like dating clearly if they're clonal. So, all right, let's back up away from sort of ant specific science and let's talk about science with a capital S as one of our final questions for the day. In the beginning of your spiel, you discussed how physics and physicists are needed in biomedical research. Can you elaborate on that? That's a question from our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to speak specifically about behavior and actually specifically about the work that I do, because that's sort of the best and most descriptive way that I can talk about this. But I think there's lots of examples of how physicists are super helpful in biomedical research. From our perspective, or from anyone who's studying behavior's perspective, a lot of behavior, we need really complex models to describe it, or we need really complex systems in order to test the behavior. And I do not have the skills to design those things myself. A lot of the work you saw today relied on a physicist who actually used to be in the lab that I'm currently in, who did all of the behavioral tracking and designed the software so that we can actually track everywhere that every ant in a colony is going, so that we can ask questions like who's interacting with who, or in my case, I study a lot of alarm behavior. So I'm like, who's running away? Who's running towards? And questions like that. We really need people who are experts to help us design these softwares and design these behavioral setups.
Yeah, I feel like the expertise in science is becoming so niche that not having a diverse team actually is prohibitive to doing research. So, but thanks for clarifying that. And okay, we do have time for one last question again from Juan, and who wonders if any thought was given to whether the increased grooming and interaction for sick ants could partially be explained by them being more likely to be in one location as opposed to them being detected as sick. Because if you notice in the blue, it sort of was just like, are they just getting more interactions because more ants are coming to them?
That's a great question.
That is a great question, actually. Yeah.
I think there's great experiments you could do to test that. I think it would be really neat to sort of see what if this is probably the crudest way you could do it, but if you pulled 2 legs off an ant so it walked around less, do you see these sorts of things? I mean, the ant is still kind of sick, but not really sick.
Right. Like what do you need? Yeah.
You could there are really cool experiments from people who study ants and other insects who will put like magnets in or robots in who sort of mimic these kinds of behaviors and see, well, you can still groom this robot because it's around a lot and it smells like an ant.